Welcome back. You're listening to the panel discussion in recognition of National Cybersecurity Awareness Month, Cybersecurity versus Data Security, the government's two-pronged challenge, sponsored by Cloudera on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. I'm Jason Miller, your host. In this part of the discussion, we turn to Eddie Garcia, the Chief Security Architect in the Office of the CTO for Cloudera. Eddie, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
So in the first part of the show, we've been discussing the big data challenge as it applies to cybersecurity. We heard about the promise of continuous diagnostics and mitigation, or CDM program that DHS is rolling out across government. We talked about the ever-widening attack surface that agencies and other organizations face with the widespread use of mobile devices, or now the beginning of the Internet of Things that's really starting to take hold. And of course, we talked about the people challenge when it comes to cyber, big data, and who has access to what types of information and when. So again, Eddie Garcia, the Chief Security Architect in the Office of the CTO at Cloudera. Let's get your perspective. How is big data changing the way agencies and organizations really approach cybersecurity?
So what we're seeing is that many organizations that have implemented traditional data security tools is that they're lacking some of the user behavior part of it. So big data platforms enable us to look at data from different ways, taking into consideration other pieces of information that we couldn't do before. This gives us a new perspective and insights that we couldn't detect before.
When you talk about user behavior, do you mean the fact that computers are smarter than people?
Well, no, actually, so what I'm talking about with user behavior is that we're being able to see a person that maybe has access to data, but he's using it in a way that he doesn't typically do on his normal job. So we can now say, why is he looking at this data? Why is he downloading these files? So there's a different behavior for that user, and can lead you to ask, well, has his account been compromised? Is that the reason? Or is he planning to leave the organization and start to download files onto his thumb drive? So looking at these other pieces of information, data points, that allow you to do better security analytics.
So it's in many ways, it's looking for anomalies in the way people act. All of a sudden, are you usually in from 9 to 5, and all of a sudden are you in at 7 in the morning, and all of a sudden are you logging on at midnight? That can ring basically an alarm bell to have at least the manager go, hey, Eddie, what's going on here?
Exactly. So being able to see logs, queries, being able to detect from multiple systems, aggregating the data together, and holistically being able to detect these anomalies.
And that also is not just the people piece, right? But it's also if all of a sudden there's a port that's been open or a signature that's coming in, and that's also where big data and the analytics of that come in to help the agency secure their systems even better.
Oh yes, machine and log data is one of the central components into cybersecurity. User behavior is helping, but that's one of the key pieces that you should have within your system, always monitoring, logging all of your firewalls and devices.
Do you get the sense from your experience working with federal agencies and other organizations that they're moving in that direction to understand how all this data can be used to look at behavior, to look at different signatures, go back to the word anomalies in their network?
Yes, from two perspectives, within their single agency or organization, but also starting to collaborate and share those across agencies, and that's where it's really going to get the most value as we start to see one organization maybe has some type of a signature pattern of what's going on. They're able to share it with others and be able to be more proactive about it before something happens.
And I think that's what we talked about earlier in the show when we heard from DHS when they talked about CDM, the Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation Program, and the dashboards that they're bringing up both at an agency level and, of course, at the government-wide level. So does this take us to a point where cybersecurity is more about data security than anything else? Because for so long we've always said it's all about the data, but it seems to be, by the way you're describing it, people are starting to realize that finally.
Well, I guess it's not only about the data. So as we heard in the panel, they're really interconnected, and one depends on the other. So you have to have both data security and cybersecurity. They're both interrelated, and you need to have both of them in place.
Give me a definition of data security and cybersecurity from your perspective, because I think for a long time when you talk about cybersecurity, we were talking about data security. One example that kind of comes to mind is the Federal Information Security Management Act, right? So the FISMA, the big dog of the law, talks about federal information, again, data information. But when you talk about cyber, there's more to it.
Yeah, so when we're talking about data security, those are the same basic principles around strong authentication, encryption, monitoring, and just the basic fundamentals that every organization should have. When you're talking about cybersecurity, you're talking about being able to look at more what's happening around the data, how it's being used, who's accessing, what are the different patterns, how do within different systems that are processing data, being able to correlate it together to gain new information.
And that correlation, I think, is where the data analytics come in. But the other piece is the encryption, the strong authentication, is something that the government's really been focused on. Is that the right thing to focus on, or are we at the point now where data security really is in the end? Because I hear so many times about mobility as just one example. We don't care what device you use. We don't care if you lose your device. We just care about the data, if it gets hacked or if it gets if the device gets lost or stolen, can they get to the data? And if they can't, then they can have the device.
Yeah, so we need to focus on both of them. At the end of the day, we need to have data security from the sprint that we saw, being able to increase 30% the use of strong multi-factor authentication. That's great. I mean, multi-factor authentication is one of those things that will reduce risk. So like we heard on the panel, it's really about reducing risk. And if you start to have very good practices around encryption, around multi-factor authentication, least privilege, all these things are the building blocks to be able to have a very strong foundation. So you need to have those.
Let's talk a little bit more about risk. I'd like to kind of pull that string a little bit. We hear everything's about risk management, managing risk. Where does the big data piece fit in to help you manage that risk better? Because so many times you can say, well, this is important data, and that's important data, and this is important data. So how do you figure out, okay, what's really important based on, not just mission, but what you're seeing in the analytics?
Yeah, so being able to identify where the data is really a problem. So when you talk about the big data platform and you're loading a lot of information, it may be easy to have, for example, PII just slipped in there and nobody knew about it. So being able to understand where the data is and being able to identify what is more critical to protect first. So you don't want to just protect everything in the same fashion. You want to first and prioritize what is more critical, like PII, sensitive information. You want to focus there. So that's one of the tenets with the risk management.
Does having a strong data analytics infrastructure help you kind of prioritize? Do you get a sense to see who's using it, what it's being used for? Or again, that's maybe it goes back to a mission, and data analytics just opens the aperture a little wider.
So there's a combination of two, of how it's being used for the mission and who's using it, but then also from the other side, from the machine and log data, what are the bad actors trying to target as well?
I think that's the fascinating piece. What are they trying to target? You may think, oh, this database is huge, I got to protect it, but they don't even care about it, or they realize I can't get into that database anyways, I'm going to go to a different database. Does that come up sometimes as you're looking at log data, as you're helping organizations, agencies, or private sector firms, and you're showing them the analytics, going, hey guys, do you see that one over there? That's a challenge. That's the one you got to protect.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing, and it came up on the panel, is a good patch management policy. So, for example, being to say, okay, this vulnerability is out, and we're now starting to see some bad actors trying to take advantage of it. So you're able to focus what servers are they trying to target to see if they can exploit that vulnerability.
Well, don't get us started on patch management. I think we could have a whole discussion on that. Let's talk about what Cloudera is seeing, just generally speaking, in the government, public sector side. What are some of the things that agencies are doing to take advantage of all this data that they have to make better decisions to protect their data and their networks?
From many different ways they're taking advantage of it, but I think really the biggest one that's paying off is the user behavior. That's where we're starting to see, because this is a new thing that they couldn't see before. This is new information around how people are accessing, how people are using these systems, and that's really where they're starting to see a lot of payoff.
Do you think that this is a end result of the insider threat concerns, whether it's the Edward Snowden or the WikiLeaks, or is it even just a part of the evolution that of course is going to happen as you get as you understand cybersecurity more, as you understand your data more?
Well, we're starting to understand more that it's not just an insider threat, but someone that is an authorized user that has authorized credentials that have been compromised. So they're using those credentials with phishing and spear phishing. So being able to take advantage of those credentials to access data. So that's where really it looks like an insider threat, but it could have been just some leaked credentials.
You bring up spear phishing. I think it's a great piece of information to go down the path because of what happened with OPM, but also what happened. Every agency is really, that's their biggest concern. That's their biggest security threat. So, if Eddie Garcia, again, usually works on data X, but all of a sudden he's working on data Y, that is another sign that the spear phishing, you may have been hit by spear phishing, even though you think you've done everything the right way. Is that something that's why this user behavior piece is becoming more important because of that threat of spear phishing?
Yes, that is one of the reasons. And that's also where, for example, multi-factor, that's why it's so important to have that base foundation, because even if someone gets your compromised login password, maybe he doesn't have the second factor.
Advice for agencies as they are looking at big data, as they're looking at their cybersecurity, what are some of the best practices or potholes to avoid when you start to really use your data to make decisions around cybersecurity?
So understanding your data, that's the first step. Doing inventory of your data, understanding the different sensitivity levels of the data, that's really where it starts. And to build in security into the architecture, we heard it from the panel as well, it's very difficult to retrofit security into existing systems. But when you start with systems with security in mind from the start, it's much easier.
I think that's good advice. Understand your data, build in security from the start. I think we've been saying that for a couple of years now, huh? It seems old. All right, unfortunately, though, that's all the time we have for today. You've been listening to our panel discussion in recognition of National Cybersecurity Awareness Month, Cybersecurity versus Data Security, Government's Two-Pronged Challenge, sponsored by Cloudera on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. I'm your host, Jason Miller. I'd like to thank our guests today, Eddie Garcia, the Chief Security Architect in the Office of the CTO for Cloudera, and Barron-DiCamillo, the Director of U.S. CERT at the Homeland Security Department, Bill Lay, the Deputy Chief Information Officer for Information Assurance and Chief Information Security Officer at the Department of State, and Dr. Ron Ross, a Fellow at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. For more information and to listen to the discussion again, visit federalnewsradio.com, search Cloudera.
On behalf of Cloudera, thank you for joining our discussion. We'll have the archive from this session available shortly, and a link will be sent to you to share with your colleagues. Those of you who requested a training certificate will receive an email with download instructions immediately following the webinar. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you.